One act of kindness was all it took to turn my quiet, unremarkable life into a nightmare framed for a massive crime. I went from a nobody to the face of a citywide manhunt, targeted by an organized scheme and hunted by the Service of Internal Security. I've always been the guy who keeps his head down. I work a soul-crushing job in data entry. I live in a quiet apartment complex on the edge of the city, and my biggest thrill is picking up a lukewarm coffee on the way to the subway. I'm the definition of unremarkable. That was exactly why what happened on Tuesday felt like the universe had suddenly peeled back its skin to show me the rotting muscle underneath. It was raining. That cold, sideways sleet that turns the sidewalk into a gray slurry. I was walking home, my hood pulled low, trying to calculate if I could afford another week of instant noodles. That's when I saw her. She was struggling near the corner of 4th and Main, pinned against the brick wall of an abandoned storefront. She couldn't have been more than 5 feet tall, bent nearly double, leaning heavily on a rusted cane that looked like it would snap under the weight of a breeze. Beside her sat 2 bulging canvas bags, soaked through and leaking the faint metallic scent of wet produce. I stopped. I didn't want to be a hero. I just didn't want to walk past someone who looked like they were about to collapse. "Need a hand, ma'am?" I asked, my voice sounding thin against the wind. She looked up. Her face was a landscape of deep, sun-baked wrinkles, but her eyes, they were unnervingly sharp, a piercing, icy blue that seemed far too young for the rest of her body. She didn't thank me. She just nodded once, a quick jerky motion, and gestured to the bags. I leaned down to grab the handles. They were heavier than they looked. As I hoisted them, a strange sound caught my attention, a muffled, rhythmic thudding coming from the bag on the left, like a pulse. I frowned, checking to see if I'd hit a carton of eggs, but the bag felt dense, structured. I brushed it off as my own fatigue. I offered my arm to the old woman, and she took it with a grip that felt like a vice. Her hand wasn't soft. It was like holding onto a coil of wire. We started walking toward her building, an old looming tenement I'd passed 100 times but never really looked at. The lights in the lobby were flickering, casting long, jagged shadows that danced like skeletons against the peeling wallpaper. The air inside smelled of dust and something sharp, like ozone or bleach. As we reached the elevator, a rickety brass-caged relic that looked like it belonged in a museum, she stopped. She didn't let go of my arm. Instead, she leaned in, her cold breath brushing against my ear, sending a jolt of ice down my spine. Her voice wasn't the quavering tone of an elderly woman. It was raspy, steady, and terrifyingly clear. "You have a kind heart, boy," she whispered, her fingers digging into my bicep until I winced. "But kindness is a currency in this neighborhood, and you're spending it on a ghost. Look closely at the bag you're holding. Do you hear that? That's not produce. That's the sound of the organized scheme catching up to the man you think you are." I tried to pull back, but she tightened her grip. I looked down at the bag again. The thudding had stopped. Instead, I saw a thin, red trickle starting to leak from the bottom of the canvas, spreading across my sneaker like a blooming ink blot. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. I opened my mouth to shout, to run, but the elevator doors groaned open before I could move. Inside the small, confined space, pinned against the wall, stood a man I recognized from the morning news. The man reported to be the mastermind behind a massive illegal operation, wanted by the Service of Internal Security for his role in a major distribution ring. He was holding a piece of illegal equipment, his eyes locked on mine with a look of predatory recognition. He didn't look surprised to see me. He looked like he'd been waiting for me to be the one to deliver his package. The old woman let go of my arm and stepped inside, turning to look back at me. She smiled, but it was a jagged, cruel expression that didn't reach her icy eyes. "He's the one," she said, nodding at me as if presenting a gift. "He's the perfect face for the fall." The man raised the weapon, and the elevator doors began to slide shut, locking me into a nightmare I hadn't realized I was already part of. The elevator doors clanged shut with the finality of a prison gate, sealing me into a space that smelled of wet iron and terror. The man, the one the media called a ghost, a mastermind of a shadowy organized scheme, didn't move, yet the air in the tiny car grew heavy, suffocating. His finger hovered near the trigger of the illegal equipment, his face a mask of cold, professional indifference. I pressed my back against the brass railing, the metal freezing against my skin, my breath catching in my throat. "I don't know who you are," I managed to stammer, my voice cracking like glass. "I just helped her with the bags. I don't know what's in there. I'm just a guy on his way home." The old woman chuckled, a dry, rasping sound that reminded me of dead leaves skittering across pavement. She stood in the corner, her posture no longer hunched, her cane now held with the casual balance of a practiced tactician. She wasn't frail. She was merely coiled, waiting. "Everyone is just a guy until the Service of Internal Security tracks their GPS," she said, her eyes gleaming with a manic spark. "You walked into this sector at precisely 6:14 p.m. You were caught on the perimeter cameras. To them, you aren't a helper. You're an accomplice carrying a payload of prohibited substances and evidence of a massive organized scheme." I looked down at the canvas bag. The red stain on my sneaker had expanded, dark and thick. My stomach churned. If I opened that bag, I knew my life as an anonymous data entry clerk would be over. The contents weren't just evidence, they were a death sentence. The man leveled the illegal equipment at my chest. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes promised that if I screamed, if I tried to push the emergency stop, or if I even moved the wrong way, my story would end on the grimy floor of this elevator. "You're going to be the face they circulate on the morning broadcast," the man finally whispered. His voice was gravelly, devoid of any humanity. "When they breach this building, they'll find us gone. But they will find you, and they will find the cargo. You'll be facing a mountain of allegations, an attempt to break your life with legal charges that carry an enormous term behind bars. By the time you try to explain that you were just a good Samaritan, the network will have already framed you as the primary contractor." I felt the elevator lurch. We were moving upward. I had seconds, maybe a minute, before we hit a floor where they intended to dispose of me, or worse, hand me over to the authorities as the fall guy. My mind raced. Every horror movie, every true crime podcast I'd ever ignored suddenly flooded my consciousness. I had to move, but the man's weapon was steady. Suddenly, the elevator shuddered. A piercing, high-pitched alarm began to blare, the building's fire suppression system. The lights flickered and died, plunging us into a strobe-like haze of red emergency illumination. The man's focus wavered for a split second as he adjusted his grip on the weapon. It was the only opening I would get. I didn't think. I lunged. I swung the heavy, blood-soaked canvas bag with every ounce of desperate strength I possessed, slamming it into the man's chest. The weight sent him staggering backward, his illegal equipment discharging into the ceiling with a deafening roar. Sparks showered down like fireworks. The old woman let out a sharp cry of rage, her cane lashing out to trip me, but I was already scrambling toward the control panel. I smashed the button for the lobby, hoping, praying the system would override. The elevator jolted, bucked, and began a rapid, sickening descent. The man regained his footing, his face twisted in a mask of pure hate, and he lunged for me. I felt his hand close around my throat, his grip like iron, squeezing the oxygen out of my lungs. I clawed at his arm, my eyes bulging as the elevator continued to scream downward. Through the gap in the closing doors, I caught a glimpse of the lobby floor approaching, and standing there, bathed in the flashing strobe lights, was a team in tactical gear, weapons drawn, shouting commands that I couldn't hear over the pounding in my own ears. The doors slid open, and I fell out onto the marble floor, gasping for air, the man tumbling out behind me. I looked up, expecting to be saved. Instead, I saw the team shift their aim. They weren't looking at the man. They were looking directly at me. And in that moment, as the laser sights painted my chest, I realized with chilling clarity that I was holding the bag, and the evidence inside was spilling out right at their feet. The world narrowed down to the red dots dancing on my hoodie. Laser sights from the tactical team. I was on my knees, lungs burning, the heavy canvas bag sprawled open beside me. The contents hadn't spilled out as packets of illegal substances, but rather as a collection of high-density data drives and encrypted hardware. To the tactical team, I wasn't a victim. I was a tech courier caught in the act. "Drop the bag. Hands on your head, now!" The man who had been in the elevator with me, the mastermind, was gone. In the split second the elevator doors had groaned open, he had slipped into the shadows of the utility stairwell, leaving me as the only target. The old woman had vanished too, having maneuvered herself into the chaos with a grace that betrayed her supposed infirmity. I was the lone soul on the marble floor, trembling, trapped in a narrative I hadn't written. I did as I was told, dropping to the floor and pressing my forehead against the cold tile. I felt the weight of boots circling me, the metallic click of restraints. My mind was a blur, but a single terrifying thought remained. The Service of Internal Security didn't take chances. I was facing an attempt to break my life with legal charges that carried an enormous term behind bars. "I didn't do it!" I screamed, the sound echoing off the lobby walls. "The woman! She left through the stairs. I was set up!" A heavy hand grabbed my hair, pulling my head back. I stared into the face of a lead officer. He didn't look angry. He looked bored. He leaned in, his radio crackling with static. "We've been tracking this organized scheme for 6 months, kid. We know the old lady legend. She's the ghost, the middleman. And you're the one who just walked into our perimeter with a hard drive that contains the entire blueprint for their operation." He tossed a plastic bag of prohibited substances, likely planted in the lobby moments before I arrived, onto the floor next to me. "Adding a bit of weight to the case, aren't we? You're looking at decades. Tell us who you're working for, and maybe you see daylight before you're 60. I realized then that the kindness I'd shown had been calculated by them from the start. They didn't need a mastermind. They needed a pawn who could be processed, interrogated, and broken. As they dragged me toward the transport van, I saw her. Standing in the darkened doorway of a neighboring cafe, the old woman was watching. She adjusted her shawl, pulled out a phone, and made a quick call. She wasn't running. She was reporting. The interrogation room was a sterile box of white light. For hours, they hammered me with questions, playing back footage of me carrying those bags, looking for every angle that made me seem like a willing participant. I held on to the truth like a drowning man to a life raft, recounting the meeting on the corner, the way her hand had felt like wire, the sound of the elevator. They laughed. It sounded like a fairy tale designed by a defense attorney to obfuscate the truth. But then, the lead investigator walked back in. He looked tired. He dropped a file on the table. "We found the prints on the bag handles," he muttered, his voice devoid of its earlier aggression. "They aren't yours, and we found the old woman's cane in the trash chute. It was a transmitter. She wasn't just a runner. She was a bait layer for a different department of the Internal Security Service. They were running a sting against the mastermind, and you were the civilian they decided was expendable to make the catch look authentic." The silence in the room was deafening. My heart slowed from a frantic gallop to a steady, rhythmic thud. "You're free to go," he said, staring at the floor, "but don't expect an apology. People who get caught in these webs usually just disappear. You got lucky that the evidence we found on those drives was enough to burn the mastermind without needing your coerced confession." I walked out into the early morning light. The city was waking up, oblivious to the fact that I had just spent the night staring into the abyss of a decade-long prison term. I didn't go back to my apartment. I didn't go to my job. I walked until my feet ached, leaving behind the man who used to care about his lukewarm coffee and his quiet life. I knew now that the world was a thin membrane over a chaotic, violent machine, and I had been lucky enough to be spit back out before it could digest me. I never looked back at the apartment complex. I never checked the news. I just kept walking, a ghost in a city that would never know how close I came to losing everything to a lie.